then a Friday in Parliament is any hour of CBC programming. But boy, did last Friday change that up a little bit. In fairness, it wasn't even what happened on Friday, because no one quite noticed in real time, or at least no one said out loud what was happening. It was only over the weekend when people started to digest and wonder, did that really happen? I am referring, of course, to this moment.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian-Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. And I was going to say he's in the gallery, but I think you beat me to that. But I'm very proud to say that he is from North Bay and from my riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service. Thank you.
And just like that, everyone rises to their feet. A standing ovation for a Ukrainian hero and a Canadian hero. Now, that in and of itself is not news, but when you delve into the details a bit and you listen closely to the introduction, a Ukrainian who fought against Russia in World War II, you start to wonder, okay, well, maybe you don't have to be a huge history buff to realize that Russia, or the Soviet Union as it then was inexplicable, well, not inexplicably, but was inexplicably to today's understanding of things in a modern context, the good guy in that conflict. Yes, the Soviet Union was one of the Allied forces against the Nazis. There was very good reason for that, and as it stands, things happened afterwards that made us realize, if we didn't already, perhaps they weren't the good guys overall in history, but in that moment, they were on the right side. So it stands to reason that those fighting against the Soviets in World War II were on the wrong side. Now, history is complicated, and war is complicated, and sometimes you can easily go down the road of believing that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And I point that out because I think for a lot of Ukrainians who saw and understood the incredible genocide that had taken place against them at the hands of Stalin and the Soviet Union, they would say that, well, maybe the Soviets are our enemies more than Nazi Germany. So even if they are on the wrong side of history overall, you can understand how Ukrainians may have looked at the Soviets and not been as fond of having them as an ally as Britain and the US and Canada and France, etc. were. Now, that is not excusing people who embrace Nazism, certainly not today. And I think it's not excusing the things that were done by the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the 1st Galician, which later on was rebranded, for obvious reasons, as the 1st Ukrainian Division. That was the unit in which this man, Yaroslav Hunka, was a member. That is the division in which this man fought for his country, but ultimately fought for the Nazi war efforts. And it is not something that a lot of people commenting on really knew about, I don't think. I think people could have probably put two and two together, as you kind of saw House of Commons Speaker Anthony Rota doing there, that if someone was fighting against the Soviets, they must have been fighting with the Nazis. There are some people who knew history really, really well that would have assumed when this came up that perhaps he was one of the Ukrainian nationalists who were trying to establish an independent Ukraine in the 1930s and 40s and were fighting against the Nazis and the Soviets. That was the interpretation that I've seen from some people who do know that chapter of history very well. And they assumed that the vetting had been done. They assumed that if we are looking at this guy in the House of Commons and honoring him, that surely we're not putting up a guy there who fought with the Nazis. But alas, that did not, in fact, take place. And it was really, really interesting to see the condemnation start to flow. Now, Karina Gould, who decided to pose for this photo with Mr. 𝐂𝐿𝐔, was very indignant at this whole thing, urged anyone and everyone to not politicize it. She ended up speaking in the House of Commons, doing the number one two-step of the Liberal government, which is to point the blame at someone else.
Mr. Speaker, I would just like to respond to my honourable colleague, because I think we both share the frustration about what happened on Friday, but I do want to reiterate, and as you have made very clear in your statement, Mr. Speaker, that this was your initiative. The Government of Canada had no knowledge of this individual coming to... The government had no knowledge. The Speaker is responsible for this chamber. He invited him of his own accord, and he made the decision himself to recognize him. Neither the Government of Canada nor the delegation of Ukraine had any knowledge of this. I would respectfully submit, Mr. Speaker, that you clarify this for the members opposite, because it's important that this information be clear and that these false allegations do not continue, because they're not true. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader, then the Government House Leader, before anything starts, I just want to make it clear that it was my decision, and my decision alone. This was a constituent who wanted to see what they wanted to be here, and I recognized him. It was my decision, and I apologize profusely. I cannot tell you how regretful it is. And it may not be good enough for some of you, and for that I apologize. And I'll let the Honourable Opposition House Leader take it from here, and then we'll go to the Government House Leader.
He has faced a great many criticisms over the last couple of days from the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CJA, which has condemned this incident, from B'nai B'rith, which is another Jewish advocacy group, also from the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, again, another group that does very good work on this, and was actually led by a former Liberal member of Parliament in Michael Levitt. And despite all of this condemnation, by the way, on Yom Kippur, when the Jewish people would love to be focusing on that, and instead have to feel very aggrieved by the standing ovation given for a literal Nazi veteran in the House of Commons on Friday. Anthony Rota has apologized. He's taken responsibility. He said it was his and his decision alone. The Liberal government knew nothing about it. The Prime Minister knew nothing about it. Trudeau never met with the guy. Ignore that little photo that Karina Gould took in the hallway. But then there was this post from one of the members of the veteran's family, Teresa 𝐂𝐿𝐔, who shares this image of this man, Yaroslav, waiting for Trudeau and Zelensky, waiting in the reception hall. Now, I've not seen a photo of him with Trudeau and Zelensky. I don't know if any of them met. Maybe they were promised a meeting and it never happened. Maybe they thought they were getting a meeting. But nevertheless, it's not exactly something that we can just put at Anthony Rota's feet and say this has nothing to do with anyone else, which is what the Liberals have been committing to. As it stands now, the NDP has called for Speaker Anthony Rota to resign, as has the Bloc Québécois. The Conservatives have called for accountability. They don't believe the Speaker is the problem. They believe Justin Trudeau is the problem, and I think there's probably some good reason for that. Here's a guy who loves theatrics at every turn, a guy who has never seen a photo op he didn't like. And what happens when he is caught literally presiding over a moment in the House of Commons in which there is a veteran who served with the Nazis up in the gallery, not just there, he didn't just sneak in the back, he was an invited guest, and the Liberals are saying, well, yeah, we all need to do it. They're doing their whole learning opportunity thing. This is now a learning opportunity for everyone but the people responsible. I will say two things on this that may be a little bit unpopular. I am one of the most, I should back up and say that I actually had the great privilege in 2011 of visiting Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Israel. And I was able to build off of my, high school civics and high school history and rudimentary first-year university history by steeping myself in Holocaust history. It was a very challenging week, but I learned a great deal that I've carried with me in the interceding 12 years. I am very, very keen on history and remembering the Holocaust and honoring those who lost their lives in this, which means I have zero sympathy whatsoever for Nazis. And I say that while also understanding, as I mentioned earlier on in the show, the complexity of history, that there are people who did not fight alongside the Nazis because they had it out for the Jewish people. They fought the Nazis because they believed, as many Ukrainians did, that Hitler was going to be their liberator. So when you look at the full history of this, and Canada went through this in the 1980s with something called the 𝐁𝐈 Commission, which looked at Nazi war criminals in Canada. And they ultimately decided, this commission, that they would not view the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division as inherently criminal, despite the fact that it had been called such at Nuremberg. In Canada, they didn't go that distance, and they said that it was down to individual conduct, and these people didn't hide that they were in this division like other Nazis did. These people didn't lie about it, and in this particular case, we have no evidence of what this man individually did during World War II. So we can say that perhaps he was not involved in anything that would make our skin crawl, and anything that would just have us calling for justice. But we can also say that he should not be given a standing ovation in a hall of government in Canada. And in a lot of ways, I don't know this man. I will never know this man. I don't know if the Liberals have not just hung him out to dry and now spend his dying days living with the shame and embarrassment and humiliation of this, when he just kept his head down. No one would have known who he was. No one would have questioned his past, and that would have been that. So I feel for his family, who are going through something now they probably never thought was going to happen to their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather. But this is exactly the situation we're in, with a society that does not know its history, and a society that believes the enemy of your enemy is your friend, because we've decided in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for good reason, as you've heard me say, that Russia is the bad guy. Anyone who fought against Russia, irrespective of the circumstances, therefore must be a good guy. That was what led to this horrendous and shameful display on Friday. Now, let me just, before we go to our first guest on this show, share a bit of a clip, because we have seen some denunciation from the folks involved here, like Jennifer O'Connell, the Liberal Member of Parliament.
Curious if she thinks there should be consequences or reprimand for members of this House who meet with known Nazis, who spread misinformation, disinformation, glorify the Holocaust, who speak against anti-Muslim rhetoric. I'm just curious if she's talking about online hate and privacy of Canadians and regulation. Does she condemn her actions by meeting with a known Nazi in this country who spout anti-Muslim rhetoric?
Ooh, wait, I'm sorry, that was the wrong clip. No. She was not talking about the literal Nazi that was in the House of Commons. She was talking about a German member of the European Parliament, Christine Anderson, who tweeted this morning that she is just rolling on the floor laughing at this whole thing after the display that she got. But surely Justin Trudeau has denounced this Nazism, right?
Mr. Speaker, when did the Prime Minister lose his way? When did it happen?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Conservative Party members can stand with people who wave swastikas.
Point of order, the Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, I am a strong Jewish woman and a member of this House and a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and I have never it's never been singled out, and I have never been made to feel less, except for today, when the Prime Minister accused me of standing with swastikas. I think he owes me an apology. I'd like an apology, and I think he owes an apology to all members of this House.
When Conservative members of Parliament meet with a German member of the European Parliament, that is greeting and meeting a Nazi. When the Conservatives support Freedom Convoy demonstrators, that is standing with people who wave swastikas. When parental rights advocates descend on Parliament Hill and locations across the country, the Liberals, the activists, the media will all jump up and down and say, these are Nazis. It's amazing how in this day and age, anyone and everyone is a Nazi, except for someone who literally fought with the Nazis. That is the level of dissonance here. And you often hear the expression that when everything is racist, nothing is racist. When everyone's a Nazi, no one is a Nazi. And that's, I think, the thing here that people forget, is that Nazi means something. And we are not so far removed from history that there are not Nazis who walk on this earth, which is why Simon Wiesenthal and his followers have become so dogged in their pursuit of justice for aging Nazi criminals. There will come a time when there are none less left on this earth, and some of those will have managed to escape and evade justice. I am not calling for justice for Yaroslav Hunka. I don't know enough about his history to say whether that is warranted, but I am saying that at the very, very minimum, the lowest bar possible, so much that the Seven Dwarfs could play limbo under it, is that we shouldn't honor them and give them standing ovations in the House of Commons. Ezra Levant was one of the first people, if not the first person, to notice this. He is the Rebel commander at Rebel News and joins me now. Ezra, it's always good to talk to you. I mean, you're a Jewish man yourself, and I know you have a very high tolerance for free speech and for people having controversial and even hateful opinions, but just on a personal level, how did you feel when you saw this and clued into what people in the House of Commons didn't really clue into?
Yeah, I mean, talk about tricky language. I mean, the guy was a Nazi. I'm not saying he was like a regular GI, just a conscript in the army. He was a volunteer with Hitler's SS. That was the political hunter-killers. Those are the folks who would go after the partisan resistance. Those were the folks who would hunt for Jews in the attics. These were the vicious Hitler errand boys. They trained near Dachau. They were the division for the battalion that would shoot Jews and bury them in mass graves. So he wasn't just fighting, he was a Nazi, an SS officer. I'm curious if he has the telltale SS tattoo. Under their armpit, they would have an SS tattoo and then their blood type. Now, I wonder if Yaroslav Hunka has that. It would be terrifying to find out. This guy sort of sneaked into Canada, according to David Pugliese, Canada's leading military journalist and historian. A lot of these guys sneaked into Canada by changing the name of the battalion. They said instead of part of the 14th Waffen SS, they were with the 1st Ukrainian Battalion. And about 2,000 of these folks managed to sneak into Canada. This guy, Yaroslav Hunka, kept a low profile for a long time. I mean, he's 98. Maybe he was worried that some Mossad Nazi hunter would show up one day and get him, but he's 98. And imagine getting the phone call. You're a Nazi. You've been living low-key. You sort of lied to get into Canada. And one day you get a phone call from the government, not to prosecute you, but to champion you as this hero. Anthony Rota literally called him a hero. Now, I got a question for you. Do you think for 1 second that being a guest of honor for the entire parliament, when the foreign president of Ukraine is there, so you've got high security, everyone's been going through the metal detector because this guy, Zelensky, is under an assassination risk. Do you think for 1 second that Yaroslav Hunka was not scrutinized by not just one, but probably 10 people? Do you really think Trudeau, the master thespian, didn't know who was who? And do you think Chrystia Freeland, whose own grandfather was a Ukrainian Nazi who actually expropriated a newspaper from a Jew and turned it into a Nazi propaganda machine, do you think for a second that Chrystia Freeland didn't know exactly what was going on? And you were so right, Andrew. These liberals call everyone a Nazi. It's projection. They are the Nazi lovers. And it wasn't until the internet, including myself, connected the dots. No regime media bothered to say, oh, who's that guy? Fighting against Russia? Oh, that's our friend. Why did it take independent journalists like myself, when not a single regime journalist said, that's a bit weird? Who would have fought against Russia in the early 40s?
Well, on that note, I mean, the most charitable interpretation for this is that they are idiots. Is that you have people that don't understand the history or lack the logic and reason to just put two and two together. You don't buy that, it sounds like.
You know, Jasper Atwal, and you guys broke this story. He was the terrorist, the judge called him a terrorist, who was convicted of attempted murder when an Indian cabinet minister was visiting BC. Jasper kill him. He was convicted, declared a terrorist. Justin Trudeau invited him to go to India with him. Oh, I didn't know. You didn't know? Or you were playing domestic politics. Just like Trudeau plays domestic politics with the Sikh community, he plays domestic politics with the large Ukrainian-Canadian community. And by the way, my family's originally from Ukraine as well, from the city of Dnipro. So I'm not hostile to Ukraine. I just think that you got 2,000 Nazis who came from Ukraine to Canada. Most of them have passed away. You find the one guy who's 98, he's probably one of the, I'd be surprised if there's 5 others in the whole country. You found the one Nazi, not a fake Nazi, not a rhetorical Nazi, not a neo-Nazi, but a real Nazi who's probably got the SS tattoo under the armpit, who probably, if he was active for so many years, probably murdered a few Jews and a few resistance fighters. He probably did, Andrew. I mean, I don't know. He's never been charged.
You don't have any evidence specifically on this man.
I absolutely don't. And he will go to his grave unprosecuted. And he's lived a charmed life, Andrew. He's 98, the last 73 years or 72 years in this country. Imagine what a bizarre ending to his life. He's invited to Ottawa. The whole parliament jumps to their feet and applauds him. And they call him a hero. And he's thinking, I'm vindicated, I'm redeemed. Adolf Hitler's must be thrilled with them. And then it all comes undone. What a bizarre, bizarre life.
I've seen, I mean, there was, I can't remember the name of it now, there was a mini-series on Netflix about John Demjanovich, or Demjanovich, I recall the name, the one that they thought was, Ivan the Terrible, and you watch this, and you just see this horrible, horrible man, but to his family, he's grandpa. He's the guy that they've known that has probably never committed any criminal wrong for the last 70, 80 years of his life. And here we have a guy who's probably in a very similar boat. He's known as a loving family guy, community guy. If he had just kept his head down for 2 years, he goes to his grave with nothing. Now this is his legacy. And I don't think that there was any 3D chess being played here to try to destroy this family's life. But my goodness, that's the consequence of this, because now no one will rest until they understand this. People that had never heard of this division are now asking questions about, whoa, why did Canada just open up its doors to people that had done this?
Let me throw a few quick things at you before I go. Number one, 3 months ago, Justin Trudeau went to Kiev and met with Andrei Melnyk. He was Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, and he was fired by Zelensky for denying the Holocaust. Fired by Zelensky. Trudeau met with him. Point 2, Chrystia Freeland posed, and you guys broke this story too, with the scarf that was for Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian Nazi. How many, and by the way, if you look at David Pugliase's story in the Ottawa Citizen, Chrystia Freeland and the government have met with the Nazi Azov battalion and instructed the Canadian Armed Forces to keep a low media profile. So that's not one dalliance with Nazis. That's 2, 3, 4. How many times does Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland get to hang out with Nazis and say, whoopsies, didn't mean to? And remember, Chrystia Freeland's own grandfather was a Nazi, and she helped cover that up for years.
Well, and on the note of Freeland, too, I mean, if we go back to the ignorance argument, the ignorance plea here, Chrystia Freeland, if there is one person in the House of Commons that has no right to plead ignorant, it is Chrystia Freeland, because she knows this history intricately. It is part of her family history. She's got I think it's like a condo or a house in, downtown Kiev. She knows Ukraine well. It's like most people, like, for example, if someone had handed me the Bandera flag, I wouldn't have known what it was. Chrystia Freeland did. And that's the thing, is that if there's one person in that government that doesn't get to just hide behind that, it's her.
Yeah. You know what? It's amazing how the regime media are rushing to give Trudeau and Freeland the benefit of the doubt when you have a real live SS officer in Parliament. But you call it, but they demonize every conservative, every trucker, everyone who's worried about gender ideology in school. They call them Nazis. Never again, Andrew, can we accept the accusation of bigotry or Nazism from the Liberals. They are the only government in the world that I know of that has brought Nazis into Parliament and cheered them. And Trudeau should never be allowed to forget that for the rest of his days. You know what? Pierre Trudeau motorcycled around Montreal with a Nazi helmet in the 40s. It was a big joke. Well, 80 years later, his son brought a Nazi into Parliament. Justin Trudeau is a disgrace. We should never let him forget that.
Yeah, and it makes it look quaint when a few years ago the Liberals forgot to mention Jews on the plaque of their Holocaust memorial. I don't know if you remember that. And, that was, again, another whoopsie. Ezra, I know you have to go. I appreciate you coming on. Your coverage on this started on Twitter, and I know we'll carry on into your show tonight at Rebel News. So thank you very much.
Thanks, my friend. Bye-bye.
All right, that was Ezra Levant, the Rebel commander of Rebel News. And let me reiterate, as I pointed out to Ezra, I have zero evidence or knowledge whatsoever of Yaroslav Hunka's individual conduct. We don't know anything about his war record, and we wouldn't have known his name had he not been paraded, at least metaphorically, in front of Canadians in such a large and public way. And here's the thing. I know some people in this audience may have varying views on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I believe Ukraine is far from perfect, but I believe Russia is the aggressor. And it is interesting when you look at Russia's prime argument that they needed to denazify Ukraine. Now, I do not believe Ukraine has an active Nazi problem. I believe the Azov Battalion is a problem, and I believe that we should also acknowledge this is a country that elected a Jewish president in Zelensky. Nevertheless, Ukraine's history does have Nazi problems, and there are certain pockets of the population, of course, that will hold any number of views, which are reprehensible and should be called out. But that aside, I'm just making sure you know where I'm coming from on this. Can you imagine the propaganda win that has been given to Putin and given to Russia by literally Zelensky there giving a fist up for a Nazi on the floor of the House of Commons of Canada, one of the countries that's funneling huge amounts of money into the fight against Russia, the fight for Ukraine. Imagine how easy Justin Trudeau has made it for Vladimir Putin. We will have more on this tomorrow, I am sure. I was going to say we should segue into lighter things. I don't exactly know how light it is, but nevertheless, we will move on to a different topic here because taxpayer waste is a perennial subject in this country, and as such on the show, we always try to make note of it here. And the one thing we can always agree on, regardless of our perspectives on global geopolitical conflict and all of that, is that we should probably defund the CBC here. So this is an interesting story. CBC, which has been under the boot potentially because Pierre Poilievre has pledged to defund it and turn it into housing for Canadian families. But CBC has been sitting on, we learned through the latest documents from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a $400 million real estate portfolio, $444 million in real estate. Its downtown Toronto headquarters on Front Street is about 2/3 of this, but you have other properties in various parts of the country. And what's interesting about all of this is that we're looking at CBC, which has a budget of about, a taxpayer subsidy of about $1.3 billion every year. That's $1.3 billion. That's a lot of money. So if you were to go into government and you were to do nothing else but get rid of CBC's subsidy, which doesn't mean shut it down, it just means let it find money on its own or lay people off and roll back operations to keep costs in check, you would save $1.3 billion a year. That's astronomical. But then you also take into account CBC's holdings and you say, okay, we're going to sell these all off. Well, boom, you make $444 million, which is not bad if you are working towards balancing the budget, which admittedly does seem like it's going to take the better part of 2/3 of a century to get to. So I was watching with interest when these documents, which came out from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation originally, and were also added by an order paper question that was submitted by Conservative MP Adam Chambers. And they were looking at all of this and finding this is just for 12 properties. 12 corporation-owned properties across the country. Now you throw in other assets into the mix, like perhaps their camera equipment and some of their audio equipment, and Peter Mansbridge's old hairpiece. I believe it's actually been donated to a museum, but you never know. All of this stuff is part and parcel of where we are going to be getting the money from CBC if we decide to cut the cord on this. Chris Sims joins us every Monday from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Chris, not that we want to go and start picking out the furniture here, but have you set your eyes on anything?
Right? Some of those desks look pretty fancy. The ones that light up from inside. Also, the nerd in me wants that robot. I don't know if it's still on duty, but do you remember when we were kids, Andrew? We found out about these two kind of roller robots that deliver all the mail to all the CBC employees at that Front Street location. So like you just pointed out, it's the downtown Toronto location that takes the lion's share of this money. I think it's something crazy, like $300 million or so. So yeah, if they still have those two little bots that roll around like R2-D2 delivering people's mail, I'd probably get my dibs on that one.
Well, to be honest, I mean, the bots could probably do a better job anchoring, I think, than a lot of the people they have on air. So maybe we just, you have to forgo the robot, and you instead get Rosie Barton, and, you'll just basically do a little swap there. But, I look at this, and look, downtown Toronto real estate is important. I mean, most media companies want to be downtown because they, will get more access, and it's easier than just, like, plopping it out in, like Huntsville, Ontario or something. But we know that CBC is incapable of doing anything affordably.
No.
And this is a day and age in which, True North has been growing as a media organization with an all-remote operation. I know you're doing this show as you do a lot of your work from home in Alberta. It's not to say they could switch to all remote, but they could probably do with a lot less and choose not to.
Yeah, they really could. We have different examples across Canada of journalist-owned TV stations, for example. There's one in Victoria where it was going to get shut down, and the journalists got together and they said, hey, we don't feel like being unemployed. How about we actually buy into this thing? And it's a very humble, modest operation, but they get their news out every single day, and it works that way. And that's what's funny about it, is that whenever we start going after the CBC, Andrew, saying, hey, you guys take $1.2 billion per year. For folks who can't quite figure out what $1 billion is, picture a brand new hospital. That's how much money this costs, right? Building a brand new hospital every single year. That's what the CBC costs. And when we start getting onto them about that, they'll say something self-serving like, oh, well, what about, First Nations programming? When you actually check the documents, they spend more on their executive suite pay, Andrew, than they do on First Nations programming. And instead, when you turn on something like APTN, for example, which takes a fraction of the taxpayer dollars and does way more with it, I think they broadcast in 12 different First Nations languages. So the CBC will try to cloak itself in this, essential service, Canadian fabric thing. And it just isn't that anymore. And the example of that downtown Toronto location is exactly it.
Well, and the one thing I would point out, too, is that CBC likes to hide behind that. They like to hide behind their northern coverage and their rural and remote coverage. By the way, most folks in rural parts of the country want nothing to do with CBC, but that's neither here nor there. But you go to cbc.ca, and none of that stuff is what's on the homepage. They've got their latest news story in which they're competing with private media outlets. They've got commercial advertising, again, competing with private media outlets. I'm scrolling down here. They've got CBC Gem, so I can watch some Dragon's Den or some 22 minutes. 22 minutes is an example of something the market wouldn't provide, so probably for other reasons. But the things that they like doing are the things that are the popular stuff that competes with private players. I mean, they want to play the Olympics and they want to hold the Oscars. That's what they want to be doing.
Because then, so you get into this vortex of them trying to do stuff that's popular so they get people to watch them, but them also not providing the things that they actually are supposed to through their mandate. And so it's this vicious little cycle that goes round and round. And they've already lost Hockey Night in Canada. Why are they duplicating the things that private enterprises are trying to now compete with them with? It goes back to, you remember a few years ago, before the COVID mess hit everybody, when it came to light that it's their online print, it's their online physical typing that you can read on their website that gets the most eyeballs. Well, that's not in their mandate. Their mandate was to broadcast, that's why it's the Broadcasting Corporation, to Canadians. And then they really rubbed it in the newspaper websites' faces. They started saying things like, no paywall.
Okay, so we've got private media organizations, both right and left, we don't care. Private media organizations that are paying their journalists, who are then paying having a subscription fee so you can read their news online because they got to eat, they have to pay the bills. CBC takes money from government, takes money from taxpayers, posts the same stories, sometimes duplicating the same story, by the way, and then actually rubs it in and says no paywall. So they're really eating the lunch, in many cases, of private media organizations. And now again, this isn't the smoking gun, but it really adds to the narrative that the CBC is big and bloated and it is not delivering the programming that people expect them to.
Yeah, and I would also add to that as well that when we're talking about the galvanizing of private media, this is the government that, as you and I have spoken about, is putting in Bill C-18 because they believe it's the responsibility of big tech companies to save media in Canada and that the government is the one that should just, play with the puppet strings here. Well, if you were to take out this big competitor that's basically bigfooting them, that would help them more than C-18 will, which has effectively banned them from social media.
Yes, and to make it worse, C-18 will actually give the CBC the lion's share of that money. So at first, this was basically...
Oh, no, I asked Pablo Rodriguez about that, and he said the Australian experts say it won't.
Oh, well then if Australia's doing it, then we don't need to discover it anymore. Stop studying, everybody. We're good.
Yeah.
Seriously, this is how this works. I've spoken to the people who actually helped read and write the legislation. It's the cumulative amount of links that are posted. And so if you add all of those up in like a little bucket, like we were just describing with their eyeballs they get for online print, guess what? They get the lion's share. Now at first this was big tech versus media. So we're like, not exactly taxpayers. But now it's big tech being forced to pay money to government media, to the CBC, which is just a wing of the federal government. So now this is a tax issue.
Wanted to turn away from CBC for a moment, although I should point out that Pierre Poilievre has said he can't wait until this Toronto real estate is given up to Canadian families as housing. So if you're looking for a condo on Front Street, when Poilievre's in there, you might be able to get one. You can do the Mansbridge Suite and the Barton Suite. It'll be wonderful. But I want to ask you about this cabinet retreat. The Liberals got together in PEI a little while back, spent $275,000 on this retreat. Now, this was cabinet. This wasn't the big caucus retreat for all 170 of them or whatever. This was, there aren't that many now, but however it is. Yeah. This was just the cabinet. $275,000. Like, how much is lobster going for? This is what they were billing.
This was just brutal. And so credit where it's due. Our folks at Blacklock's Reporter dug up these documents. And you're right. This was, get this, folks. So remember last summer when inflation was really bad? I mean, it's really bad now, but it was really bad at the grocery store. It was a real fight to try to afford even hamburger for your cart. Remember also that's when interest rates started skyrocketing. Okay, things were tough. A year ago, the cabinet of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government got together and said, holy smokes, look at all this wreckage. Let's have an inflation summit. Okay, that's a good idea. But instead of having the meeting in one of the dozen meeting rooms that they have access to in Ottawa, they jetted out. Actually, this one, Andrew, was in Vancouver.
Oh, this was last year. Sorry, my mistake.
Dude, yeah, so this was at the Hyatt in Vancouver, right? They're not schlepping it on the East Coast. They're on the expensive West Coast here. They blew, like you said, $275,000. But get this, $46,000 was on catering. Catering. The tone deafness, the let them eat cake level of this is almost vicariously embarrassing. You're looking at it saying, people are struggling, they're lining up at food banks, they're cutting coupons, they can barely make it, and you blow $46,000 on catering to yourself?
And there are 39 cabinet ministers, so that is more than $1,000 a person on food alone.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. That's like King Henry VIII level eating. Like, we need to monitor them for gout. Because that's a lot of shellfish that they'd be eating right now.
I'm just picturing, like, the old medieval banquet style of, I don't know, like, Pablo Rodriguez just gnawing on, like, a giant turkey drumstick and be like, bring me some more mead.
There's, like, a goblet in one hand and this big bone meat in the other hand.
Yeah.
That's what it would have been like. And this is where it gets gross.
King Herod does Canadian politics or something.
Exactly. This is their job, to care about the mess, frankly, they created through both money printing and carbon taxes. So this is their mess, inflation, and it's their job to deal with it. They make around close to $300,000 each for salary. All of their expenses are always paid in Ottawa. But instead, to talk about this critical issue of affordability, they jet out to Vancouver and stuff themselves with $46,000 worth of catering. It's really bad.
I should tell that this is a silly story, but I think it's an interesting one. The Liberals in 2015 had a caucus retreat, so they weren't in government yet, in London, Ontario. And this is when I had the opportunity to interview. The only time I've ever interviewed Justin Trudeau was at this point.
I remember that.
I didn't go too well for him. But Sun News was around. They played that tape until it broke. It was great. But I was out, and randomly I was at a mall, which is uncharacteristic for me, and there was a Liberal MP, Judy Sgro, there. And she was coming out of the Bay, and she didn't know me. I said, Judy, Andrew Lawton, I'm a radio host in London. I didn't expect to see you here. And she launched into this stump speech, but, we're out here stimulating local economies. Well, I was just saying hi. But it was interesting, because it sort of occurred to me that if we are going to have these retreats and we're going to spend money, why not spend the money in places where it's going to really help? Why are they not having their retreat in some rural community where the factory is closed, if they're really committed to it? It's because they're not actually interested in solving these problems. They want to have a really, really glitzy getaway. And there's no earthly reason that you should have a retreat in Vancouver, which is going to cost you more than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, it's not so fun to go to Moose Town, right? Why go there?
Where's the caucus retreat in Lethbridge?
Exactly. Don't give them ideas, and then I'll have to hammer them with questions. But you're right. They could be doing something like that in order to do that, but also we start worrying about cost there, because then you're hop, skip, and jump flying. Just have them in Ottawa, for goodness sake. Taxpayers pay a lot of money to maintain these buildings. They're all staffed. Everything's transcribed. They already have hot meals delivered to them every day up on Parliament Hill. Why outsource this to a different location and then charge people more money? And the very fact that this was a special inflation summit in order to deal with the little people's problems, this was straight out of Orwell. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's that scene at the end of the book where they're peeking through the window and they can't tell the difference between the pigs and the farmers.
You misunderstand, Chris. They're trying to show us how bad inflation is by spending so much, because it's tough for a Liberal cabinet in this economy. I think we should actually just do full convergence here. Next Liberal cabinet retreat, have it at CBC headquarters. We've already paid for it.
Done! And already catered to by the robots.
All right, before it gets kicked out and converted to housing, Chris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, always great to talk to you. We will see you next Monday.
You betcha.
All right, that was Chris Sims. My thanks to her and to Ezra Levant for coming on the show today. We will talk to you tomorrow in 23 hours and 15 minutes here on The Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.